In this video, we are going to learn about dynamic sessions in Azure Container Apps. Imagine if someone told you like 10 years ago that AI agents and AIs would be alive in 2025 and they would be writing code, not just writing code, but they're doing some actual useful things to the world. You would not have believed it, right? But we are there now. AIs are doing some useful work. AIs are writing most of the code now. And as AIs takes on more and more of this work, we need to do the next logical thing. And that is providing the infrastructure, providing the tools for AIs to write better and better code. And that is where dynamic sessions come in. We're basically providing the infrastructure for AIs to write code. Not just for AIs, there are other uses as well. I'll cover it in a minute. To understand why dynamic sessions matter, think about how applications work before the era of AI. We had the HTTP endpoints and background services, and those are the main building blocks of the compute layer of applications. But modern intelligent applications need flexible and on-demand compute environments that can adapt to the unpredictable demands of AI-generated processes. Now, dynamic sessions are here to solve some of those problems. They can quickly provision isolated environments, and that is an important point. Let me just go into the documentation of dynamic sessions. The key point here is that they provide the controlled isolation for executing our code. So usually, we can think of AIs as untrusted sources when it comes to writing code. So we need proper isolation. We need to have the control isolation for it. We need it to be really fast as well, because AIs are fast. They're writing code fast. So we need to provision the infrastructure fast. We have that attribute with dynamic sessions as well. Now, dynamic sessions are not just for AIs. You can have other uses for it as well. Like, for example, let's say you have an application, an educational one, where users or students submit pieces of code. So we have to run them and validate them whether it's running properly. So we can use dynamic sessions for those kind of things. Or if you have an application, you're allowing users to build things like ETL pipelines where you have some flexibility for users to write their own code and you have to execute them. We can use dynamic sessions for those things as well. The possibilities are endless here. You can do many things with dynamic session. We have these attributes: strong isolation and fast startup, as I mentioned. We have the simple access through an HTTP endpoint, which I'll cover in a bit. These are fully managed as well. These are fully serverless. Now, when it comes to serverless, the closest technology that existed before dynamic sessions is, I believe, Azure Functions or serverless functions, where we have already provided the code for it to run. But with dynamic sessions, it has been taken to the next level where we provide the code for it to execute every time. Now, if I scroll down a bit, we have two types of sessions here. We have the code interpreter sessions and custom container sessions. So these are fully managed for us. With code interpreter sessions, you can write Python code and JavaScript code for now, but there will be more additions in the future, I believe. And this is under consumption tier. But let's say if you want to have a custom container where you have your own programming language to run, you can bring your own container. In this one, I'm going to focus on the code interpreter side of things. Now, with code interpreter, when you submit your code, the code is executed in a sandbox that is pre-installed with all the popular libraries. They are ideal for untrusted code that is generated by the users, or if they're generated by large language models. So that is the idea of code interpreters. Now, there are a few concepts that you should understand. There's this concept of a session pool. Now, if I scroll a bit, you're going to see this image. As you can see, the Azure resource that we provision to work with dynamic sessions is a session pool. So you create this session pool, and when you create the session pool, you can set parameters like the number of parallel executions, whether the sessions that are running inside of this session pool can access the internet, those things we can configure. So we provision this session pool resource on Azure. When the user submits the code, it could be you, the user, or the application submit the code. The application should provide this session identifier. So with that session identifier, a new virtual sandbox, it's a Hyper-V sandbox, is created for you for that session. When that is created, you can set the cooldown period as well. And what cooldown period means is that the time to live for that session, right? So when you first push some code to be executed, it'll create a new session for you, and you can specify, let's say, 50 seconds. Even after running your code, the session will be alive for 50 seconds. If something else comes in for that session, that sandbox will be used for executing that session. So that is the key idea here. As you can see, we are interacting with the session pool using an endpoint called pool management endpoint. So these are the sessions. So all these sessions these are Hyper-V sandbox that is created for you for that session inside of that session pool. When you create the session pool, you can configure things like, as I mentioned, maximum concurrent sessions, cooldown period, and ready session instances and things like that. So now you have the basic idea of sessions. Let's move on to do some practical work. Let's provision our first session pool. Now I'm in my Azure portal, and if I search for Container Apps session pools, we have this new resource type. I'm going to create a new Container Apps session pool. I'm going to click create, and I'm going to add a new resource group. I'm going to call it Dynamic Sessions Demo, and I'm going to call it session pool 01. Now, as you can see, we have the code interpreter option here. We have two options, Python and Node.js, and we have the custom container option. For now, the custom container option is disabled. So if you want to provision a custom container based session pool, you should use the Azure CLI for it. I'm going to use a Python code interpreter for my demo. If I go into the language type, as you can see, it's Python, and we can configure the maximum concurrent sessions. So I'm going to put it as 5. And as I mentioned earlier, we have the session cooldown period as well. What this means is that the number of seconds that the session can be idle before it's terminated, right? So I'm going to put 300 as default. And with this parameter here, we can control the outbound traffic from the session. So let's say if I go into this diagram here, we have the session pool, and we have the sessions running there. All this session is a Hyper-V sandbox. If it needs to access the internet, it can or it can't based on your preference. You can control that with this network egress option, and you can control the region as well. So those are the parameters that we need to specify when provisioning a Container Apps session pool. I'm going to create the session pool now. All right, as you can see, the session pool is ready. Now, if we go into the session pool resource, as you can see on the left, we don't have much options, but we have the playground and configuration. If I go into the configuration, we have the pool type and the pool management endpoint that I have discussed earlier, the language type, the maximum concurrent sessions, and all those configurations are here. You can dynamically change them. And now if I go into the playground, you can just play around with this. As you can see, we can specify the session identifier. Just run the code here. As you can see, we're getting two outputs here. We have the standard output of the code execution and the standard error as well. And when we use the API to do this, you're going to get a JSON with these parameters. We can set the session identifier. It's a free-form string. You can just put whatever you want here and you can execute it. And the idea here is that, as you can see, as soon as I run this code, it's executed, right? Even for a new session to be provisioned, it doesn't take even a second. It's a sub-second latency. So that's the coolest thing about this. So this is basically it when it comes to the Azure portal. And now if I move on to the documentation again, and as I mentioned, the session identifier, which I have demoed now, it's just a free-form string. And there are some guidelines here you can consider when forming the session identifier format. And the session identifier is a secure thing. You should protect it. And as you can see, the session identifier is a sensitive information which you must manage securely. And why are they asking us to manage it securely? Because we're using the API to push the code, and we authenticate it to do that, right? But the problem that they're trying to address here is that, and now let's imagine if someone steals the session ID that you're using and runs some code there. On the surface, it would not be an issue because it's just executing the code and giving you the result. But imagine a scenario where in your session, you write some files to the sandbox, right? And the other person who submits the session, if he writes the code to read all the directories and get the output, he can get access to all your files. So that's why it's important to protect your session identifiers. So you can put something like some kind of other key that would never overlap with someone else's session. And that's roughly the idea of protecting the session. As you can see, they're mentioning it, failure to secure access to sessions may result in misuse or unauthorized access to data stored in your user sessions, right? Now, when it comes to authentication and authorization, you should use Microsoft Entra ID tokens to talk to this. So the user should be registered in Azure AD, or user or the principal or the entity should be registered in Azure AD. But if you consider other Azure services, they have their own keys. But in this scenario, we don't have things like that. We need to have an entity registered in AD, and using that token, we can execute code in session pool. So that's the idea here. And now let's try to do a practical demo and see how this works. All right, as you can see, what we're going to do next is that we're going to create a session pool using the CLI. and then we're gonna push some code for it to execute using its HTTP endpoint. So what we're going to do is we're going to first create a resource group with this command right here, and this will be attached to the description down below if you want to run this. And this is straight from the documentation from Microsoft as well. Now I've created the resource group, and the next thing that we're going to do is provision the session pool. So I'm going to create the session pool as well. And as I mentioned, and this is kind of important, we don't have other keys to talk to session pools in addition to Microsoft Entra ID tokens. So after creating the session pool, we need to get a token to talk to this session pool to provision a session to run our code. So the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to get the user ID to this variable here. Now, and then as you can see, I'm going to assign Azure Container Apps session executor role. Only that role can do the executions in the session pool. So I'm going to do that with this command. All right, I'm going to set the role now. I have to set the subscription ID as well. It can take a couple of seconds. And the next thing that we need to do is we need to get the access token to talk to this resource. I'm going to copy this and paste this command here to get the access token. And with this variable here, we have the access token. I'm going to prepare the auth header as well. And the last thing that I'm going to do is we need the session pool management endpoint. So I'm gonna get the pool management endpoint using this query here, and I have assigned that to session pool management endpoint. If I just echo it, as you can see, we have the session management, the pool management endpoint. Now we can execute the code. And now, as you can see, we have this command here. And all this is doing is just invoking this session pool management endpoint /code/execute, as you can see, and we're providing the API version and we're providing the session name as well. I'm going to call it just test, and the content type is just JSON, and this is the body of it. We're just passing in properties. This is where the code lives. So this is the AI or the application generated code. As you can see, it's a for loop. It's just printing 5 hello worlds. That's it. So I'm going to copy this command here. I'm going to run it only within milliseconds. We can see the results. We have the log from the curl command. All the headers are shown here, and this is the output JSON, as you can see. I don't know whether you can see it. Let me just zoom it in a little bit. This is the output JSON. Inside properties, we have the status, and that is a success. And we have the standard output of it. We have 5 hello worlds, as you can see. This is how you get the response out from the code executor, code interpreter. And we have the standard error and results as well. Now it only took 66 milliseconds to be executed. So it is extremely fast. And that is how you interact with the code interpreter. Now, if I go into the documentation again, and if I scroll down, we covered the authentication authorization. And if I scroll down under the security section, what they're mentioning here is that these are built for executing untrusted code. So it's important that you manage the session isolation properly. And by default, as I mentioned, these sessions are not allowed to call outside endpoints. So those are the key idea. That is the interaction that I wanted to give you currently. These are the regions that this supports. And this is the end of this video. In my next video, I'll be showing you how to work with dynamic sessions using an LLM framework like AutoGen. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know in the comments down below. I'll be seeing you with another video like this soon, and thanks for watching.